Some silences are louder than screams, the nurse would later say. But in that moment Emily Carter only heard the ticking of the wall clock and the steady rhythm of her own breathing as she stood in the center of a 12,000-square-foot marble mansion that never felt like home, 9 months pregnant, and holding on to the edge of a glass table as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded, while upstairs a door closed with quiet finality, and her husband Daniel Whitmore, a man worth over $800 million, walked past her without a glance, already on his phone, already somewhere else, and that was when she realized something had shifted, not suddenly but slowly, like a crack forming beneath ice, invisible until it spreads too far to stop, because 5 years ago Daniel had promised her a life of security and love, a future wrapped in silk and certainty, and Emily had believed him. She had left behind her small-town life in Virginia, left behind her last name in practice if not on paper, and most painfully, she had stopped calling her brother, Michael Carter, the one person who had always told her to never trade her voice for comfort. But comfort had been seductive. Comfort had come with private jets and charity galas and a last name that opened doors, and over time her world had narrowed to the size of Daniel's approval, measured in quiet dinners and polite smiles and the absence of conflict. Until conflict arrived anyway, subtle at first, a missed anniversary, a late night call answered in another room, a scent on his jacket that wasn't hers, and when she asked, he smiled in a way that felt like a closed door and said she was imagining things, that pregnancy hormones made everything feel bigger than it was, and she wanted to believe him, because believing him was easier than rebuilding a life from nothing at 31 with a child on the way. So she stayed, she adjusted, she made herself smaller. And the house grew larger around her, echoing with footsteps that weren't hers, laughter she didn't recognize until even the mirrors seemed to reflect a stranger, a woman who moved carefully, spoke softly, and measured every word like it might cost her something, and tonight the air felt different, heavier, like a storm pressing against the windows, and when Daniel finally stopped pacing and looked at her, really looked at her, there was something in his eyes she couldn't name, not anger exactly, not even disappointment, but distance, like he had already decided the outcome of a conversation she hadn't started. And Emily felt a tightening in her chest that had nothing to do with the weight she carried, a quiet alarm that whispered this was the moment. Everything would change, and somewhere miles away, in a secure office lined with flags and silence, a phone remained dark, waiting for a message that hadn't been sent yet, waiting for a name that hadn't been spoken in years, because Emily Carter had spent 5 years learning how to endure, but she was about to remember how to be heard. Daniel did not raise his voice, and somehow that made everything feel colder, because calm had become his most effective weapon, the way he leaned against the edge of the staircase with one hand in his pocket and the other holding his phone, scrolling as if the conversation had already ended before it began. And when Emily finally spoke, her words came out quieter than she intended, asking where he had been. Asking why he had missed another doctor appointment. Asking why it felt like she was living in a house full of strangers, and Daniel exhaled slowly as if her questions were inconveniences he no longer had time to entertain, telling her that she needed to relax, that stress was not good for the baby, that she was overthinking things again, and the phrase overthinking landed like a familiar echo, something he had said so many times that it had started to sound like truth, and for a moment Emily hesitated, her hand resting protectively over her stomach as the baby shifted gently beneath her palm, a small reminder that she was not alone even when she felt invisible, and she tried again, this time asking about the woman she had seen earlier that week, the one who had laughed too comfortably in the kitchen, the one who had worn confidence like she belonged there, and Daniel's expression did not change, not even slightly, he only tilted his head and asked why Emily was creating problems where none existed, and that was when the room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in with a pressure that made it harder to breathe, because Emily knew what she had seen, she knew what she had felt, but his certainty was so absolute that it made her doubt her own memory, and that doubt was where he held his control, not through force but through quiet erosion, wearing down her reality until she questioned it herself, and he stepped closer then, not aggressively, not loudly, but with a presence that filled the space, telling her that she needed to focus on being a good mother, that everything else was secondary, That her role was simple if she would just accept it, and Emily felt something shift again, deeper this time, not fear exactly but clarity, like a lens snapping into focus after years of blur. Because she realized this was not about misunderstandings or stress or timing, this was about power, about who defined what was real and who was expected to accept it, and for 5 years she had accepted it, piece by piece, compromise by compromise, until there was very little of her left to recognize, and yet standing there with her back against the glass table and the city lights reflecting off the windows behind her, she felt the first spark of resistance she had allowed herself in years, small but undeniable, and Daniel saw it too. Just a flicker in her eyes, enough to make him pause for a fraction of a second before his expression hardened into something unreadable, and he said her name in a tone that sounded like a warning disguised as concern, telling her again that no one would take her seriously if she continued like this, that she was alone in her version of events, and the word alone lingered in the air longer than anything else he had said, because that had always been the quiet truth of this house, isolation wrapped in luxury. Silence dressed as peace, and Emily swallowed carefully, feeling the weight of that word settle in her chest before she slowly reached for her phone on the table, not to argue, not to prove anything, but because for the first time in years she remembered there had been a number she used to know by heart, a name she had not spoken out loud in far too long, and her fingers hovered over the screen as if crossing an invisible line, because once she pressed call there would be no returning to the version of her life that depended on staying quiet. And somewhere beyond the walls of that house, beyond the city, beyond the carefully controlled world Daniel had built, a connection still existed, waiting. Even if she had almost forgotten it herself. Her thumb hovered over the screen for what felt like a full minute, the glow of her phone reflecting faintly against the glass table while Daniel watched from a few feet away, not stepping closer, not stopping her, because in his mind she had nowhere to go, and no one left to call. And that confidence was the quiet foundation of everything he had built around her. But Emily's heartbeat had started to change, slower now, steadier. Like something inside her had finally aligned, and without looking up she scrolled to a contact that had not been touched in 5 years, a name that used to mean safety before it became silence, Michael, and just seeing it made her chest tighten with a mixture of guilt and relief, because she remembered the last conversation they had. His voice firm but not unkind, telling her that if she ever needed him she only had to say the word, and she had never said it, not even when she probably should have. Not when the distance started, not when the doubt crept in. Not when the house began to feel like a place she had to perform instead of live, and now here she was, standing barefoot on cold marble at nearly midnight, finally realizing how far she had drifted from the person who once believed she deserved better. And Daniel shifted his weight slightly, glancing at her screen with mild curiosity before returning his attention to his phone. Already dismissing the moment as another emotional reaction that would pass, and that was when Emily pressed send. Not a call, not yet, just a message, 3 words that carried 5 years of silence behind them. Mike, I am sorry. And the second the message left her phone something unexpected happened, not in the house, not in Daniel's expression, but inside her, a release, subtle but undeniable, like exhaling after holding her breath for too long, and for the first time that night she straightened her posture, her shoulders lifting slightly despite the weight she carried, and Daniel noticed it, just enough to look up again with a faint frown, as if something about her reaction did not match the script he had expected, but he said nothing, because to him nothing had changed. The house was still his, the narrative was still his, and Emily was still standing exactly where he thought she would be, but miles away in a secured building surrounded by silence and protocol. A phone vibrated once on a desk where notifications rarely went unnoticed, and a man in uniform paused mid-conversation, his eyes narrowing slightly as he read the message on the screen, not because of the words themselves, but because of who they came from, a name he had not seen in years but had never deleted. And for a brief moment the room around him seemed to fall away, replaced by memories of a younger sister who used to call him for everything, who used to laugh without hesitation, who had once promised she would never let anyone make her feel small, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he read the message again, Mike, I am sorry, and he did not respond immediately, not because he did not care, but because he understood what those words really meant. That they were not an apology but a signal, not about the past but about the present, and without raising his voice he excused himself from the room, his tone calm but final, leaving no room for questions, and back in the mansion Emily placed her phone down slowly, her hands no longer shaking, her breathing more controlled, as if something unseen had shifted the balance, and Daniel finally spoke again, asking if she was finished, his voice carrying that same quiet dismissal, but this time Emily did not answer right away. Because for the first time in years she was not measuring her response based on his reaction, she was waiting, not for his approval, but for something else entirely, something already in motion, something he had not even begun to imagine. Daniel's patience began to thin in ways he did not show with volume but with stillness, the kind that filled the room like pressure before a storm, and he set his phone down slowly this time, giving Emily his full attention for the first time that night, as if recalibrating his understanding of the situation. Because something about her silence did not match the pattern he had grown used to. She was not apologizing, not explaining, not retreating. She was simply standing there, breathing evenly, one hand resting over her stomach, the other relaxed at her side, and that calm unsettled him more than any argument could have, so he took a step closer, his voice measured as he asked again if she was done with whatever point she thought she was making, and Emily finally lifted her eyes to meet his. Not with defiance, not with fear, but with a steadiness that felt unfamiliar even to her, and for a brief second neither of them spoke. The space between them filled only by the faint hum of the city outside and the soft ticking of the clock that seemed louder now than it had before, and then Emily answered, quietly, saying yes, she was done, and the simplicity of that response seemed to confuse him, because he had expected resistance or tears or another attempt to prove something he had already dismissed, but instead she had given him nothing to push against, no emotion to redirect, no weakness to lean into, and Daniel exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if concluding that whatever shift he thought he saw was temporary, telling her that she needed rest and that this conversation was over, already turning away as though dismissing the moment entirely. But Emily did not move. She did not follow, she did not call after him, and that absence of reaction lingered in the air longer than anything she could have said, and upstairs a door closed again, the sound echoing faintly through the open space. And for the first time in years Emily did not feel the urge to go after him, to fix what had just happened, to restore the fragile balance that had defined their life together. Instead she remained exactly where she was, listening, not to him, but to the quiet shift happening inside herself, because something had changed the moment she sent that message, something irreversible, and she could feel it now in the way her thoughts no longer circled around his approval, in the way her breathing stayed steady even in the silence, and minutes passed, or maybe longer, time felt different when nothing was being forced, and then her phone vibrated softly against the glass table, a small sound that seemed to carry far more weight than it should. And she looked down at the screen, her heart tightening just slightly, as she saw the name appear, Michael, and for a moment she did not open it, not out of fear but out of understanding, because once she read whatever he had written, the distance between her past and her present would close completely, and there would be no pretending she was still alone in this, and when she finally tapped the screen the message was short, only a few words, but they landed with a certainty that settled deep in her chest. I am on my way. And Emily closed her eyes briefly, not in relief, not exactly, but in acknowledgement, because she knew her brother well enough to understand what those words meant. They were not casual, they were not symbolic, they were a decision, and somewhere beyond the walls of that house, beyond the reach of Daniel's influence, something had already begun to move, and she opened her eyes again, looking around the room that had once felt so overwhelming, so controlled. And for the first time it looked different. Not smaller, not weaker, but no longer absolute, as if its power had depended entirely on her belief in it, and now that belief was gone, replaced by something quieter but far more solid, and upstairs Daniel continued his routine, unaware that the foundation he trusted was already shifting beneath him, unaware that the silence he had cultivated was no longer protecting him but exposing him, and Emily remained still, waiting not with anxiety but with clarity, because the next sound that would break this silence would not come. from within the house. The house did not change, but the way Emily saw it did, and that difference made every sound sharper, every shadow more defined, as if the illusion had finally dropped, and what remained was something she could measure instead of fear, and she moved slowly toward the large windows overlooking the city, her reflection faint against the glass, a woman she barely recognized but was beginning to understand again, and upstairs footsteps crossed the hallway with the same confidence they always had, Daniel moving through his world as though nothing could disrupt it, because until now nothing ever had. And Emily rested her hand on the cool surface of the window, feeling the steady movement of the baby beneath her palm, grounding her, reminding her why this moment mattered more than any argument ever could, and she thought about the message again. I am on my way, simple words but not simple in meaning, because Michael Carter did not say things lightly, he did not act without purpose, and if he was coming, then something had already shifted far beyond this house, far beyond Daniel's reach. And that realization settled into her with a quiet strength that replaced the uncertainty she had carried for years, and minutes passed, stretching into something longer, not empty but full of anticipation, and then from somewhere outside, faint at first but unmistakable, came the low hum of engines approaching the long private driveway that curved toward the estate, not one car, not two, but several, moving in controlled formation, and Emily's breath slowed even further, not in fear but in recognition. Because she understood now that the world she had been kept away from had not disappeared, it had simply been waiting, and upstairs a door opened again, footsteps pausing as Daniel noticed the same sound, the engines growing louder as they came closer, and for the first time that night there was a break in his rhythm, a slight hesitation before he moved toward the balcony overlooking the front of the property, his curiosity overtaking his confidence, and Emily did not follow him. She did not need to, she already knew what he was about to see, black vehicles pulling in one after another with precision that spoke of something organized, something official, not the casual arrival of guests or business partners, but something far more deliberate, and Daniel stepped out onto the balcony, his posture straightening instinctively as he looked down, his expression tightening as the scene unfolded below, doors opening in unison, figures stepping out with quiet coordination, not rushing, not chaotic, but controlled in a way that carried authority without needing to announce it, and Emily remained inside, standing exactly where she had been, because this was not her moment to move. It was her moment to witness, and the front door opened with a firm, deliberate sound that echoed through the house, not loud but impossible to ignore, and Daniel turned sharply at that, his composure shifting just enough to reveal something beneath it, something that had not been there before, uncertainty, and footsteps entered the foyer, steady and measured, not hesitant, not seeking permission, and Emily closed her eyes for just a second, drawing in a slow breath before opening them again. Because she knew that everything after this point would be different, not because of force, not because of confrontation, but because the silence that had protected one person for so long had finally been broken by someone who did not need to raise his voice to be heard. And as those footsteps moved further into the house, the balance of power that had once felt immovable began to shift in a way Daniel could no longer control. The footsteps did not rush, and that was what made them impossible to ignore, each step measured, controlled, echoing across the marble floor with a quiet authority that did not need to announce itself, and Daniel stood at the top of the staircase now, looking down into the foyer with a posture that tried to reclaim control but no longer quite held it, his hand resting on the railing just a little tighter than before. Because what he was seeing did not fit into any version of reality he had prepared for, and at the center of it all stood a man in uniform, not loud, not dramatic, simply present, his shoulders squared, his expression calm in a way that suggested he had already assessed everything he needed to know, and Michael Carter did not look around the house as if impressed, he did not acknowledge the scale, or the wealth, or the carefully constructed image of power. His focus moved only once, directly toward the top of the stairs, locking onto Daniel with a clarity that made the distance between them feel smaller than it was, and for a moment the house held its breath, the silence shifting from something controlled to something observed, and Daniel finally spoke, his voice measured but carrying a new edge as he asked what this was supposed to mean. Who authorized this kind of entry? as if authority was something he could still define in this space. And Michael did not raise his voice when he answered, did not step forward aggressively or gesture for attention. He simply said that he was here for his sister, and the simplicity of that statement carried more weight than anything louder could have, because it reframed everything in the room. This was no longer about business or influence or social standing. This was about something Daniel had never needed to consider before, accountability that did not negotiate. And Emily could see it from where she stood, the shift in Daniel's expression as he processed the name, Carter, as recognition slowly replaced dismissal, because even in his world there were names that did not require explanation, and Michael took one step forward then, not toward confrontation but toward clarity, his presence steady, his eyes never leaving Daniel as he asked a single question, "Where is she?" And Emily felt something settle inside her at the sound of that voice, familiar and unchanged, cutting through years of silence as if they had never existed, and she stepped forward then, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough for him to see her fully, and for the first time since he had entered the house Michael's expression shifted, not into anger, not into shock, but into something deeper, something protective, something that recognized immediately what had been left unsaid, and he nodded once. A small gesture that held more reassurance than words could offer, and Daniel moved down a single step as if trying to reassert control over the situation, his tone sharpening as he insisted that this was a private matter, that whatever concern existed could be handled without spectacle. But Michael did not respond to the argument, because he was not there to debate, and the officers behind him remained still, not intervening, not escalating, simply present in a way that made it clear this moment had already been defined before anyone spoke. And Emily realized then that the power in the room had shifted completely, not through force, not through volume, but through certainty, the kind that did not need permission. And as Daniel looked between them, searching for a version of control that was no longer available, the silence returned once more, but this time it belonged to someone else. Daniel did not step down another stair, and that hesitation said more than any argument he could have made, because for the first time the space he controlled no longer responded to him the same way, and he adjusted his stance slightly, trying to recover ground through composure, as he looked directly at Michael and asked what exactly he thought he was doing, his tone carefully balanced between authority and restraint. But there was something missing now, something that had always been there before, certainty, and Michael did not move closer, did not raise his voice. He simply shifted his attention from Daniel to Emily again, as if confirming what mattered most had already been identified, and when he spoke it was not to challenge but to clarify, asking her quietly if she was ready to leave, and that question landed differently than anything else that had been said in the room, because it placed the decision back where it had not been for a very long time, with her, and Emily felt it immediately, the weight of choice returning in a way that was both unfamiliar and steady. And she looked around the space that had once defined her life, the high ceilings, the glass walls, the polished surfaces that reflected everything except truth, and for a moment there was silence again, not forced, not controlled, just present, and Daniel spoke into it quickly, stepping down one stair now as if urgency had replaced his earlier caution, insisting that there was no reason for her to leave, that whatever misunderstanding existed could be handled privately, that bringing outside attention into this was unnecessary, and the word misunderstanding hung in the air like something fragile, because even he seemed to recognize how little it held now, and Emily turned her gaze back to him, not sharply, not emotionally, but with a clarity that had not been there before, and she said his name once, softly, as if closing a chapter rather than starting an argument. And for a brief second Daniel's expression shifted again, searching for something familiar in her tone that he could hold on to, but there was nothing there for him to use, no hesitation, no apology, just a quiet finality, and behind Michael the officers remained still, not intervening, not speaking, their presence alone defining the boundaries of the moment, and Emily took a single step forward, then another, moving across the marble floor with a steadiness that surprised even her, until she stood beside her brother. Not behind him, not shielded, but aligned, and Michael did not reach for her immediately, did not pull her away, he simply adjusted his stance slightly to match hers, acknowledging her position without overtaking it, and Daniel watched the movement closely, his eyes narrowing as he processed what it meant, because this was not a reaction he had anticipated, this was not a temporary defiance or emotional response that could be redirected, this was a decision, and decisions were harder to control. And he took another step down, his voice tightening just enough to reveal the pressure beneath it as he reminded her of everything they had built, everything at stake, the life she would be walking away from. But Emily did not look back at the house, she did not look at the staircase or the space behind him, she kept her focus forward, and when she finally answered her voice was calm, almost quiet enough to miss if someone was not listening closely, but every word was clear. She said that she was not walking away from anything that belonged to her, and that simple statement shifted the meaning of the entire room, because it redefined what ownership really was, and Daniel's silence after that was longer than any pause before, as if the framework he relied on no longer applied, and Michael inclined his head slightly, not in approval but in acknowledgement, and then he turned toward the door, not rushing, not commanding, simply moving with the certainty that the decision had already been made, and Emily followed, step by step, without hesitation, leaving behind a space that suddenly felt smaller than it ever had before, and as the front door opened again and the night air moved in, Daniel remained where he was. Standing between floors, caught in a moment he could no longer control, watching as the silence he once shaped walked out of his house without asking permission. The night air felt different the moment Emily stepped outside, cooler, sharper, as if the world beyond those walls had been waiting for her to remember it existed, and the line of black vehicles stretched across the driveway with quiet precision, their engines humming low like a steady heartbeat, not rushed, not chaotic, just present, and for the first time in years she felt the absence of pressure in her chest. The kind she had not even realized she had been carrying until it was gone, and Michael walked beside her without speaking, his pace matched to hers without needing to adjust, a silent awareness that had always been there between them, and when they reached the first vehicle he opened the door not as a gesture of control but of choice, stepping back slightly to let her decide, and Emily paused for a moment, looking out over the long driveway that curved away from the house, the lights glowing softly against the dark. And she could feel the weight of everything behind her. The years, the silence, the compromises that had shaped her into someone she no longer recognized, and yet none of it pulled her back, because for the first time she understood that leaving was not losing, it was reclaiming, and she placed one hand against the doorframe, steadying herself as she shifted her weight, the baby moving gently as if responding to the change, and then she stepped inside, settling into the seat with a quiet breath that felt deeper than any she had taken in that house. And Michael closed the door carefully, not rushed, not dramatic, and walked around to the other side before getting in beside her, and the moment he did the vehicles began to move, one by one, pulling away from the estate with the same controlled precision they had arrived with, and Emily did not look back immediately, not because she was avoiding it but because she did not need to. The image of that house was already clear in her mind, and when she finally turned her head it was smaller than she remembered, not physically but in meaning. Its presence no longer overwhelming, no longer defining, just a structure fading into distance, and inside the car the silence was different now, not heavy, not uncertain, but calm, and Michael glanced at her briefly, not asking questions, not pressing for explanations, simply confirming that she was there, that she was safe, and that was enough for now, and Emily let her head rest lightly against the seat, her eyes closing for a second as she felt the movement of the road beneath them, the steady rhythm replacing the tension she had grown used to, and then her phone vibrated again in her hand, a new message lighting up the screen, not from Michael this time but from an unknown number, and she frowned slightly before opening it, her breath catching just a fraction as she read the words, a notification that legal action had already been initiated, documentation filed, accounts flagged for review, processes set in motion that she had not asked for but now understood. And she looked up at Michael, a question forming without needing to be spoken. And he gave a small nod, not confirming details but acknowledging the direction things were moving, and Emily exhaled slowly, not in relief, not yet, but in recognition, because this was not just an escape, this was the beginning of something that would reach far beyond tonight, and as the convoy merged onto the main road, city lights stretching ahead like a path she had not seen in years, the silence between them held steady. Filled not with uncertainty but with the quiet understanding that what came next would not be controlled by fear, and somewhere behind them, in a house that had once felt untouchable, the first signs of change had already begun to unfold. By the time the convoy reached the city limits, the sky had begun to lighten just slightly, a faint gray stretching across the horizon like the start of something not yet fully defined, and Emily watched it through the window without speaking, her reflection blending with the passing lights, no longer a figure trapped behind glass but someone moving forward, and the car slowed as they approached a secure building set back from the main road, its exterior simple, almost unremarkable, but the moment the gates opened without hesitation it was clear this was a place where access was not questioned, only granted, and the vehicles entered one by one, coming to a controlled stop beneath a covered entrance, and Michael stepped out first, turning back to her not with urgency but with presence, offering his hand not because she needed help but because she did not have to do this alone anymore, and Emily accepted it, stepping out into the cool morning air. Her posture steady despite everything that had changed in just a few hours, and inside the building the environment was quiet, efficient, people moving with purpose but without noise, acknowledging Michael with brief nods that spoke of respect without spectacle, and Emily was guided to a private room where soft lighting replaced the harsh brightness she had expected, a space designed not for display but for clarity, and she sat down slowly, her hand resting again over her stomach as the baby shifted, grounding her in the present, and Michael remained standing for a moment before taking a seat across from her, his gaze steady, not demanding answers, not pressing her to explain what had already been understood, and for a few seconds neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer heavy but necessary, and then Emily finally broke it, her voice quiet but clear as she said she should have called sooner, and Michael shook his head once, not dismissing her words but removing the weight from them, telling her that she called when it mattered, and that was enough, and something in that response settled the last piece of tension she had been holding, not erasing the past but placing it where it belonged, behind her, and a soft knock came at the door before it opened slightly, a legal advisor stepping in with a folder in hand, explaining in calm, measured tones that protective measures had already been initiated, that documentation was in place, that everything moving forward would be handled within a structure designed to ensure clarity and accountability, and Emily listened, not overwhelmed, not confused, but focused. Because for the first time the process was not something happening to her, it was something she was part of, and as the advisor continued outlining next steps, timelines, and safeguards, Emily felt a quiet shift inside herself, not dramatic, not sudden, but real, like stepping into a role she had always been capable of but had never been allowed to fully claim, and Michael watched her as she asked her first question, simple but direct, confirming details, seeking understanding, and he nodded slightly. Not because she needed permission but because he recognized the moment, and when the meeting ended and the room fell quiet again, Emily stood up slowly, moving toward the window where the city was now fully awake, the early light reflecting off buildings that no longer felt distant or unreachable, and she placed her hand against the glass, not as a barrier but as a point of contact, and behind her Michael remained where he was, not stepping forward, not interrupting, simply present, and after a moment she turned back, her expression calm, steady, and for the first time since the night began, completely her own, and outside the building the world continued as it always had, unaware of the shift that had taken place, unaware that somewhere within its boundaries a woman had stepped out of silence and into something far stronger, something that did not need to be announced to exist, and far behind them, in a house that had once seemed untouchable, the absence of that silence had already begun to reveal everything it had been hiding. Because some structures do not collapse in noise, they fall the moment the person holding them together finally lets go.